Hi, welcome everyone. I'm so glad you could join us all tonight. We are going to go ahead and get started here. This is JFSA's Brain Health and Wellness Initiative series, where we bring community education each month to educate and promote a broad landscape for brain health. We offer CEUs to our professional audience as well. Today's topic is food for thought, nutrition and cognition, presented by JFSA's Medical Director, Dr. Grossman. My name is Jonathan Yassani, and along with my colleague Hannah Thompson, we provide care navigation to the JFSA Dementia Care Navigation Program. The program that we have, it creates an empowering environment to help improve the quality of life of those who have dementia or are at risk of developing dementia, while helping family caregivers reduce the stress and burden oftentimes that occurs while caregiving. Hannah and I work with our clients' strengths with a person-centered approach by developing and implementing individualized care plans, from linking persons with dementia and their families with community resources to following them with their medical management by assuring we address their biopsychosocial needs. At JFSA, we work together as a team with a multidisciplinary group of geriatricians, nurses, social workers, and geriatric psychiatrists. While presenting, please feel free to address any questions, thoughts, or comments to the Q&A icon. We will take some time after the presentation to answer some of your questions. Dr. Grossman, a graduate of Case Western Reserve School of Medicine with over 30 years experience in internal medicine, he has been on the staff of University Hospitals Bedford at Ahuja Medical Centers, Cleveland Clinic South Point, and Marymount Hospitals, Metro Health Medical Center, current medical director at JFSA, and a clinical instructor at the Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine. Dr. Grossman has served as chairman of medicine and chief of staff at UH Bedford Medical Center. He has had affiliations with several nursing homes where he followed his patients after their discharge from hospital stays. He offers continuity of care and values the personal relationships with patients by following them over time with continuous monitoring to ensure positive health outcomes. For the past 30 years, Dr. Grossman has been interested in the effects of diet on chronic Western diseases and promoted plant-based diets and macrobiotic diets. Dr. Grossman believes that they play a key component in preventing and reversing some types of diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, stroke, and degenerative joint disease. Without further ado, here is Dr. Grossman.
Thank you. Good to be here tonight on this cold evening. So the topic is influences on your cognitive ability and what you can or cannot do about that. The influences on our ability to be sharp mentally have to do with our heredity. Some of us have good genes, some of us have not so good genes. So depending on how you're dealt the cards, you have to work with that. Your age, as we get older, our ability to function mentally will decline. Also, your state of wellness. If you have any illness or any disease processes going on, those also will be part of the component of your mental ability. Whether you've been exposed to toxins in the past or in the present, ongoing exposures. Along with this, I could also add deficiencies. Certain deficiencies of vitamins would be kind of in that category. How much inflammatory activity is going on in your body. And I'll get back to this because in many ways, this is one of the key things that you can modify in terms of lifestyle and in terms of diet. And the last thing, lifestyle, which encompasses a whole variable of activities that can influence your cognitive ability. Thank you. So I start with the Serenity Prayer, which is, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Well, I think I wrote that wrong. Well, anyway, the idea is that there are some things you can change. There are some things you cannot change, and we want to focus on the things that we can change. Okay. So you cannot change, obviously, your heredity. You cannot change your age or aging. But there have been some studies in the past few years that have shown that even with heredity, and one particular hereditary marker is the ApoE4 marker, which is seen in Alzheimer's. We know that if one of your parents has that marker, you are four times as likely to get Alzheimer's. If both parents have that marker, you are 9 times as likely to get Alzheimer's. And yet with disease modification, you can almost eliminate those increases in terms of with lifestyle modification, you can alter your chances of developing Alzheimer's, even if you have that gene, the ApoE4. Oops. I have a heavy hand here, hold on. Okay, I think this is it. Is this right? What we can change. Illness. Obviously, when you're ill, it affects your whole body in many ways, but it also affects your mental state. The brain takes up about 4% of the body, but it also uses about 20% of your oxygen. Exposures to toxins. And again, most of those are in the environment or in the diet. Your inflammatory state. How much inflammation is going through your body. And most people think of inflammation as, I've got arthritis, my joints are hurting me, aches and pains, swelling in the knee joints. But actually inflammation can go out throughout the body. It can start in the gut. There can be inflammation in the gut. We have many diseases that create an inflammatory response there. There's inflammation in the lungs, there's inflammation in the blood vessels, and there's inflammation in the brain. And I'll get back to that because, again, I think that's one of the most important factors in terms of what you can do to modify your risk for cognitive decline. Lifestyle. We know that exercise is beneficial. We know that all forms of exercise, with few exceptions, improve cognitive ability. And some of that just has to do with the increased ability to provide the brain with oxygen-rich blood. Stress reduction. And stress reduction plays into something that I'll speak of a little bit later, which has to do with the sympathetic, parasympathetic tone in your body. And you have an autonomic nervous system, which is behind the scenes nervous system. And it has 2 components. It has the sympathetic, which is the fight or flight, and the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest. And it's the balance between those two that's important, so that if you can modify that, you will see that there are some benefits to cognitive ability. Social interaction. And obviously in this time of COVID, that's very pertinent. Social interaction, we now realize more than ever how important it is, how the lack of social interaction, face-to-face, physical touch, things like that, has really impacted people's mental health. And in some ways, we look at it in terms of depression, isolation, but also in terms of just plain cognitive ability. It can contribute to increasing or decreasing your mental state. intellectual stimulation, obviously, things that improve and stretch your mind, your memory. We all feel that those are important. And lastly, diet. And that's the thrust of my talk. You can pick any of these points and go at length, but I'm going to present some of the dietary factors. So to give you a background, if you looked at the two most important components of mental decline in Western civilization and in the United States, vascular dementia and Alzheimer's disease would be your top two. And it's also shown that vascular dementia, which is basically blood vessels impacting the flow of nutrients and oxygen to the brain, impact also the Alzheimer's patient's demise. So these two both are affected by the autonomic nervous system and also by the inflammatory state of the individual. So somehow, let's see. So let me get forward on this. I talked about the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, which is either sympathetic or parasympathetic, is one of the things that we try to make sure that people can somehow address in terms of decreasing the amount of sympathetic tone in their body. And it has been shown through many studies that the lower the sympathetic tone you have in your body, the better your mental state is and your performance on tests. There's a term which is called forest bathing, where if you take a walk outside in a non-city environment or in a park or along the beach, and if you did that for an hour once a week, you actually decrease your sympathetic tone, and it lasts for several weeks. It's called forest bathing. I'm not sure why they use that term. And so when you decrease your sympathetic tone and you subject people to taking examinations, those people that you have decreased their sympathetic tone in improve their performance. You can pit the same person on similar tests once they've done something to decrease the sympathetic tone and once they have high sympathetic tone, and compare the two, and you'll see quite consistently that they perform better when their sympathetic tone is decreased. Elevation of the inflammatory response. Chronic elevation of the inflammatory response is a very complex situation. It is our immune system. It is what protects us from the environment and from things in the environment that may do us harm. So it's always on the alert, on the lookout. And yet some people's immune system is hypervigilant. And in those cases, there is actually a detrimental effect on their ability to perform in terms of their mental state. And then lastly, elevated glucose, sugar, and insulin levels will lead to something called glycation of proteins within the body and also within the brain. And this will also decrease the cognitive ability of the individual. So let's start with elevation of sympathetic system. In the sympathetic system, adrenaline and cortisol are the hallmarks of the sympathetic tone. The higher levels of these, the more there is impairment in terms of the cognitive ability. By decreasing that tone, by increasing the sympathetic tone, you can actually improve performance. And how is this done? Well, we know some of the things that do it. Exercise, a regimen of regular exercise, stress reduction, and some of the stress reductions could be just breathing exercises, and there's a whole myriad of them. Meditation, yoga, and practices like yoga, even social connections, and adequate sleep. So getting the right amount of sleep and peaceful, restful sleep. All these things decrease the sympathetic tone. So these are what we can do to address excess sympathetic tone. Number two, and how about diet? Well, we also know that there are a few things that will increase your sympathetic tone. We know that using a lot of stimulants, and probably the most common one is caffeine, excess calories. If you take in more calories than you utilize during the day, this will also lead to increased sympathetic tone. And then certain food additives. So those are three specific dietary factors that will affect it. So diseases that cause chronic elevations of the inflammatory response, or I should say, chronic inflammatory responses are seen in these diseases: vascular disease, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, dementia, and a few others, just about everything. Inflammation affects the brain in two main ways. And one of the most striking ways is that when we have an increased inflammatory response, the linings of our blood vessels, which is called the endothelium, it's a very smooth kind of Teflon lining of all of our blood vessels, especially the ones that go up through the neck and into the brain, become more and more irregular and predispose people to the narrowing of these arteries and deposits of plaques and predisposition to mini strokes and vascular injury, vascular dementia. And then the second part is that inflammation will damage the barrier between the brain and the rest of the body. And by doing that, you can get leakage of toxins, and you can get direct damage to the neurons through this damage. The diet is critical in affecting the immune system. And one of the ways it is critical is that if you have a healthy diet, you have a healthy microbiome. That's the gut, the bacteria in the gut, trillions of them. And why they're so important is that if they are very diverse, if they are of the certain type that are beneficial, then they help with protecting the lining so that the lining of the gut does not leak. It does not allow things such as toxins or irritants or foreign substances that the body does not want to get through that barrier and cause systemic injury and ultimately cause inflammation in other areas of the body. 6 key components of the diet that influence inflammation. And I will go into a little more detail to explain these. I'm throwing a lot of information out at you. You don't have to know all the specifics, but I think it's good to at least get a smattering of them. So number one, the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids. Fatty acids in your diet, and they're important in terms of inflammation and anti-inflammation. The glycemic load of food, how much sugar is presented to the body in terms of what ends up in your blood vessels based on the foods you eat. The fiber content of foods, and the fiber content is critical in terms of a diverse and healthy microbiome. The amount of arachidonic acid that you ingest, And that's a certain type of acid found in proteins in certain foods. The levels of antioxidants or the lack of antioxidants. And as I mentioned before, microbiome, which also plays into the fiber content of your foods. So to get back to the first part, omega-6, omega-3 fatty acids. We need omega-6s and omega-3s to be healthy. They're essential. They're part of our foods. But what's happened over the past century, actually maybe 100 years now, it's 2020, but let's say at the turn of the 19th century, our diet had a ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 of about 1:1. Now our ratio is closer to 40:1. And one of the reasons why that's important is that excess amounts of omega-6 create inflammation. Omega-6 fatty acids are inflammatory, omega-3s are anti-inflammatory. So the higher the ratio you have, the more inflammation is presented to the body in terms of your diet. Why did we get this way? Well, we were able to figure out how to extract oils from plants, and corn oil, soybean oil, safflower, peanut, vegetable oils became kind of the way that food was processed, and it was added to many foods. We cook in these oils. We utilize them in packaging foods and preparation. And so because of how we've changed our consumption based on the ability to do it, we've increased the amount of omega-6s in our diet. We've also decreased the consumption of a lot of omega-3 foods such as cold water fish, flaxseed, tuna, salmon, anchovies, and seaweed. But in addition to that, how we raise our animals. So if you were to take a grass-fed, free-ranged animal, whether it was a cow or a chicken, or versus a commercialized, pen-raised or feedlot-raised animal, the ratio of omega-3 foods in the grass-fed, free-range is much higher than in the feedlot animals. So again, this is another way that even those of us that, if we eat meat, we've changed how we've eaten it because of the way we've raised our animals. And so there is some loss of omega-3s there. Arachidonic acid. We eat a lot of foods which are high in arachidonic acid. We do need some arachidonic acid, but excess amounts of arachidonic acid tend to become pro-inflammatory. So these are substances that have quite a bit of arachidonic acid and should be eaten in moderation. A lot of these are fast food components of most of the commercialized food chains. So the three keys to limiting inflammation are: improve your ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, decrease the 6s, increase the 3s, lower the intake of arachidonic acid foods. And then the last component has to do with lowering the intake of high glycemic foods, foods that in the body turn to high sugar, what we call glucose in the bloodstream. And these foods lead to prolonged elevated blood sugars, elevated insulin levels, elevated triglyceride levels, and inflammation. And inflammation, if we go back to the previous slides, inflammation is a key component in damaging the blood vessels and damaging the blood-brain barrier. What's interesting about elevated triglycerides, as a side note, is that when you have excess calories, and if most of them or many of them are sugars, they get stored in the body in fat cells as triglycerides. And that's good because you want to have some storage because There may be maybe feast and famine. You may not be able to eat for a while. So then you can release those food stores. And the way you release those food stores is that the fat cells release the triglycerides, break them down into free fatty acids. They go out into the bloodstream, and we have material to metabolize, and this is the ideal way. However, if you are someone who is eating a lot of high glycemic foods and you have high elevations in your blood sugar chronically, you will have high insulin levels. And insulin actually is a storage hormone. It will inhibit the fat cells' ability to take those triglycerides and open up the door and break them down and release them into the bloodstream. So you have insulin floating around, you may be hungry, but your body is not going to let go of your stores. The bank's closed, and you got to go out and eat some more stuff. So hence obesity. So glycation. Glycation is the irreversible binding of sugar, glucose, onto a protein. And we measure that in our bloodstream because, especially with diabetics or pre-diabetics, we're looking for how much sugar is bound to their red blood cells, which is a protein. Hemoglobin is a protein. And when the hemoglobin is released into the bloodstream from your bone marrow, which is where it's made, it sees the number of sugar molecules floating around, and the percentage of the surface of that red cell that's coated is an indication of how much sugar was in the bloodstream that day. And then we measure it because about 1% of your red blood cells turn over every day. So if you take a sample, you've got an idea of what the last 100 days were like for those red blood cells to see how much sugar was around. We measure that percentage, and the higher the percentage, the more you're predisposed to prediabetes or diabetes. And these are a little bit about the levels. Well, why is that important? Well, these sugars, not only do they bind to the protein in the blood, but they can also bind to proteins in blood vessels and in the brain. And you can glycate proteins in a lot of places. And we've seen that there is damage to the blood vessels. They become narrow, they lose their elasticity. Remember, well, actually, when sugar is bound to protein, it loses its structure. It changes its structure. It's less flexible. And so part of this has to do with inflexibility and then damage to the lining and areas where narrowing takes place because there are substances like cholesterol that build up in those areas. The end result is that there is vascular insufficiency, and this can cause mini strokes and lead to vascular dementia. And we use the term AGEs, advanced glycation end products. This is kind of an esoteric term, but I just want to throw it out there. As I said, the sugar, when it binds to the protein, it deforms the protein. When it deforms the protein in the brain, this actually accelerates amyloid plaque formation in Alzheimer's disease. They've shown this in experimentation and in studying the effects on diabetics of AGE formation and Alzheimer's disease. So how does diet affect cognition? Well, number one, we've shown that the sympathetic tone is increased with stimulants, excess calories, and food additives. Number two, that inflammation is tied to our choice of food and can cause damage to the lining of blood vessels, to the blood-brain barrier, and ultimately cause damage and cognitive decline. And lastly, glycation and AGE formation is a product of how much sugar or processed food we consume in our diet. The four components of diet: carbohydrates. Number one, we want to look for low glycemic, non-processed foods versus high glycemic processed foods. Proteins, we want animal pasture raised, grass-fed versus feedlot raised. Cold water fish have, I'm sorry, that's the next category. And fat, omega-6 versus omega-3. Cold water fish are omega-3s, but there's also decreasing your omega-6 consumption, which has really been sky high in the past 50 years. And lastly, fiber content for a healthy gut, decreasing the amount of inflammation through having a solid structure in the gut so that there are no invasions into the bloodstream and causing an inflammatory response throughout the body. Dietary keys: low glycemic foods, eliminate sugar, high fructose, and processed carbohydrates. Decrease inflammatory foods, high in omega-6 and arachidonic acid. Increase your fiber intake. Whole foods, and I didn't really go that much into antioxidants and phytochemicals, but these are in fruits and vegetables primarily, and decrease inflammation, decrease free radicals. Avoid high heat frying and grilling. High heat frying and grilling actually increases the AGE component of foods. And then lastly, sitting down, eating meals, eating slowly, preferably socially. All that has to do is increasing your parasympathetic tone, decreasing your sympathetic tone. And I reference a few of the books that people can look at and get some idea of what research has been done in these areas. Some of these books are more geared towards whole food, plant-based diets. Others are really studies of all Western diets. And so I want to thank you for listening, and I'm open to questions and concerns. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grossman. So yes, we can go ahead and take some time now, and if you have any questions or comments, please direct them to the Q&A icon, and we will be happy to address those. So the first question, what does glycation mean?
So glycation means, glyco is sugar, and glycation is the process of sugar binding to a protein. It's just a term that that scientists give to the process of a sugar molecule attaching to a protein molecule.
That's a good question. Do you recommend whole foods, plant-based diet? So whole foods, like this grocery store maybe, do they? I don't know.
Yes, I'm getting paid by Whole Foods, and you should shop. So Whole Foods, the idea behind Whole Foods is that you're not processing the food. That's all. You're not putting it in a package. And so any grocery store has Whole Foods. It doesn't have to be Whole Foods. It doesn't have to be Trader Joe's. It doesn't have to be Giant Eagle or Heinen's or wherever you go. What you will find is that almost all grocery stores are laid out the same way. If you go around the outside of the grocery store, all the whole foods are there. If you go up and down the aisles, all the processed foods are there. So I would suggest you first tour the outside of the grocery store, not the outside, the the rim of the grocery store, vegetables, fruits, you know, things like that, fish, and whole grains, and then go up and down the aisles if you want to supplement. So that's my idea of whole foods.
So what are your thoughts on, like, do you advocate for a vegan diet, or how do you feel about people actually eating meat?
So I don't have any problem with people eating meat. And you know, it's funny because everybody's different. Some of this is heredity. Some people process foods differently than other people. I think you should limit your protein intake, your meat intake, and you should choose wisely. If you want to eat meat, I would choose grass-fed, free range. I would certainly, and in fact, eggs. I would certainly choose free range poultry, much different, higher omega-3s. You can even read the labels on the eggs. And in terms of vegan, so a vegan can get by on ho-hos, Twinkies, and ding dongs. So I wouldn't say, you know, there's nothing special about being a vegan. It's a form, I guess, a form of vegetarian. It's probably healthy for many people, but there are some people that, you know, there's nothing said there about consuming sugar. So I think it's really about not consuming a lot of sugary foods, a lot of processed foods. And, you know, when vegans follow that, they have a healthy vegan diet, but you could have an unhealthy vegan diet. So it's not that simple.
What are your thoughts about air fryers? Like, do you feel like the air fryer makes the food healthier, or is it just another gimmick?
So I think that the idea behind air fryers is less oil. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's probably a better choice, because again, what you're using most of the time are vegetable oils, which are high in omega-6s. A couple of the oils that are not high in omega-6s would be olive oil and sesame oil. I'm not sure about coconut oil, but certainly olive oil is a monosaccharide, doesn't have high. Canola oil is not as bad. The ratio is not as high omega-6. So if the air fryer decreases your oil intake, that's good. And you can, depending on who you want to go by, if it's somebody like Dr. Esselstyn, who's the cardiology, the guy that's reversing heart disease, he says no oil at all. So, but some are not as stringent. And I think that lowering the amount of vegetable oil, processed vegetable oil, is probably a good idea, and that might help.
What would be the first thing you would recommend to reduce inflammation?
That's a good question. Well, I guess I would look at your diet and see which is the component that may be most contributing to it. For instance, if you're somebody who doesn't have a sweet tooth, but likes a lot of oily stuff, greasy stuff, I would address that part, because that's probably the part that's affecting it. If you're somebody that eats a lot of meat, a lot of arachidonic acid foods, I would address that. And if you're somebody that just, you know, can't stay away from bakery, sweets, candy, whatever, I would look at that. So for everybody, every individual, it's different. It's really the thing that's most impacting your diet. I would address that first.
So how do you feel about supplements? Supplements like just having the omega-3s instead of getting them through food, through a supplement? And do you have any recommendations just in general for what kind of supplements to add to a diet just to stay healthy?
So that's a good question. Our diets are, because of how we farm, because of how we produce food and commercially present food, and how our soil has become depleted, we probably do need some supplementation. I'm not sure what the best advice on that is, except that organic foods are probably better. Again, unprocessed foods. And what supplements, for instance, the omega-3s, omega-6s, well, first of all, you can raise your omega-3s by taking omega-3 supplements, but you probably would do it better with food, but you can take some omega-3 fish oil or flaxseed oil capsules. But you're better off reducing your omega-6s so that the ratio is better. Again, you need them both, but it's the ratio that's more important. So, and in terms of other supplements, I'm a firm believer, especially in Cleveland, Ohio, where the sun don't shine. I would encourage you to take vitamin D3, at least 2,000 units a day. It's probably not a bad idea to take 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C. And, they are not going to harm you. And there have been studies that have correlated low vitamin D with poor immune function. So you want to boost your immune system, especially in these times. And I think those two things certainly would help.
Thank you. So I have a question here. So with having diabetes, is that reversible, or once someone already has diabetes, do they have it for life? Or is there something they can do, like taking anti-inflammatories, to reverse the effects of diabetes?
So anti-inflammatories are not going to reduce diabetes. The diabetic is in somewhat of an inflammatory state, and there's good indication that diet plays a big part in that inflammatory state. And there are two opposing schools about how to treat diabetes. So it depends on which school you want to enroll in and believe in, and also, again, individually, which one works with you. And some of that may have to do with heredity. There are some people that actually do better on a low carb diet, diabetics. But there are many people that do better on a whole food plant-based diet, which is not low carb, but it is complex carbohydrates. So foods that are low in inflammatory components and that do not elevate in a very rapid way your blood sugar are the key, in terms of my opinion, for most people. There are exceptions. There are some people that cannot tolerate carbohydrates, period, in which case those people may benefit from trying under medical supervision, a low carb diet. But for most people, whole food, plant-based, low glycemic foods will create a situation where there's lower insulin levels. When there are lower insulin levels, there's lower inflammation, and the body will, in many ways, reverse some of the aspects of diabetes. People will get off their medication, and can diabetes be cured? I'm not sure. I think if you have a predisposition to it, you can certainly alleviate it and put it in its place, but you have to be vigilant, and you have to kind of make sure that you are not eating the wrong foods, doing stressful things, and increasing your inflammation. But anti-inflammatories are not the way to go. They don't decrease your inflammation in terms of diabetes.
What are some good proteins you would recommend?
Well, most of the proteins, so there is a lot of proteins in complex carbohydrates, lentils, beans, whole grains. I think there are some really good cold water, wild caught fish, things like that, for people that like meat or just have to have meat. Obviously, grass-fed, free range. Those are the things that are quality protein, organically grown if you can afford it. If not, still whole grains. Make it whole foods, whole grains, and not something that's been processed. So those are and again, there's a lot of protein in vegetables and in legumes. So you don't just have to look at meat and dairy and things like that.
What does high heat frying mean? As typically frying is done at 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Just not clear on the high heat.
So, so deep frying is a lot higher than 350 degrees. So this would refer to putting it on a barbecue grill, deep frying it in oil, broiling it for prolonged periods of time. It's the temperature over time. So those two components that added up will change the protein and fat in the food and create more AGEs.
Well, thank you everyone for your questions. I'm just going to do a quick run through here to make sure we answered all of them. If you guys have any questions that come to mind later on, please feel free to reach out to one of us. I'll have our information in the following slides. So it looks like we answered all the questions up to now. So I want to go ahead and continue on. So as I mentioned, here's our contact information. My colleague Hannah and we have our phone numbers here and our email addresses. So please feel free just to shoot us an email, give us a call if you'd like, if you had any questions or concerns, and I can always direct them to Dr. Grossman if that question's for him. And here's our contact information. I'll just leave it up for a moment so you guys can jot it down if you'd like. And so here with our dementia care navigation team, we work with 2 geriatricians through our clinic, and they are Dr. Elizabeth O'Toole and Dr. Magulius. They both have years of experience working in memory care, and They actually really help with our program where we create that individualized care plan that's monitored medically through them. So if something comes up, we can just go ahead and reach out to them, and we can usually get any issues resolved fairly quickly because they're right on our team and they're a great addition. And if you have any questions about their background or want to know more about them, please feel free to contact me and I will be happy to help you with that. In addition, we have our Savvy Caregiver Facilitator. That's another program that's part of our Dementia Care Navigation program. And her information's here. She also runs our Zoom support group for caregivers. And here's Nicole Herbert Hale's information. She is also a care navigator, case manager, and she is working with our clients as well. Some additional resources, as I mentioned, the Savvy Caregiver Workshops program, which is a training program for family caregivers. It's not a support group. You actually have the opportunity to learn self-care techniques, ways of approaching situations that occur with your person that you're caring for with dementia, and ways of understanding why certain behaviors happen and how to reevaluate situations. In our dementia support group, you can reach out to Nicole if you'd like more information on that. And we also have our respite and supportive home care program that is part of our Care Path program, our Dementia Care Navigation. And we really look at one situation as a whole, and we're looking at not only the person with dementia, we're also wanting to help the person that's the caregiver, because they're on the front line, and we want to be sure we're reducing the caregiver stress and burden associated with that. And we have, of course, our Brain Health and Wellness Initiative series that you're on tonight. And I wanted to let you guys all know about our next one. It's going to actually be on the 18th of February, and that's going to be between 6:30 and 7:30. And it's going to be presented by Leanne. It's Smart Brain Health Resolutions. And again, if you have any questions about that or would like to get signed up or want to add anyone please feel free to contact Nicole Herbert Hale. And I also wanted to let everyone know that there will be a link available to retrieve the presentation in PDF form. We highly encourage all to complete our survey, which you will receive through the email that you registered for this class. If you are wanting CEUs, it is mandatory to complete the survey. And this session is recorded, so we will be working on getting that linked up as well. So we'll have future access to this. I hope you all found this really helpful and educational, and I'm so glad you joined us. So have a great evening, and we will be sure to get those questions answered if anything comes. Thank you so much.